Captain Marcus Blackwood stood at attention in the grand throne room, his polished boots reflecting the golden light from the crystal chandeliers above. 20 years of loyal service to the crown had earned him the highest position any soldier could dream of, Captain of the Royal Guard. His uniform bore the silver eagle crest, a symbol of honor that his father and grandfather had worn before him, the weight of tradition pressed on his shoulders like an invisible cloak. King Edmund sat on his throne, his fingers drumming against the carved armrest. The royal court buzzed with whispers as nobles in silk robes gathered around marble columns. Something felt different today. The usual warmth in the king's eyes had been replaced by something colder, more calculating. Marcus had noticed the change over recent months, but today it seemed more pronounced. "Captain Blackwood," the king's voice echoed through the vast chamber. "Come forward." Marcus stepped forward with practiced precision, his sword clanking softly against his leg. He had protected this king from assassins, led armies into battle for the crown, and never once questioned an order. His loyalty was absolute, or so he thought until this moment. "Your Majesty." Marcus bowed deeply, his hand placed over his heart in the traditional salute. The king leaned forward, his crown catching the light. "There's a matter of great importance that requires your immediate attention. A group of rebels has been discovered in the eastern provinces. They call themselves the Voice of the People and spread dangerous ideas about freedom and equality." Marcus nodded, expecting another routine mission to capture criminals. He had done this countless times before. Rebels were nothing new in the kingdom, and crushing them was part of his duty. "These rebels," the king continued, his voice growing harder, "have been providing food and medicine to the poor villages. They've built schools and taught children to read. Most dangerous of all, they've been telling people that they deserve better lives." A chill ran down Marcus's spine. This didn't sound like the usual criminals he was sent to capture. These people were helping others, not harming them. He kept his expression neutral, but inside, questions began to stir like leaves in a storm. The king stood up, his royal robes flowing around him. "I want you to arrest their leaders and bring them to the dungeons. Make examples of them. The people need to remember who rules this land." Marcus felt his throat tighten. "Your Majesty, what crimes have they committed? Helping the poor and teaching children doesn't sound like treason." The throne room fell silent. Nobles stopped their whispered conversations and stared. No one questioned the king's orders, especially not the captain of the royal guard. The king's eyes narrowed, and Marcus could see anger building behind them like storm clouds. "Are you questioning my judgment, Captain?" The king's voice was ice cold. Marcus straightened his shoulders. "I serve justice, Your Majesty. I need to understand what laws these people have broken." The king descended the steps slowly, each footfall echoing in the silent chamber. When he reached Marcus, he spoke in a low voice that only the captain could hear. "The law is whatever I say it is. These people challenge my authority by making the poor believe they deserve more. That is treason enough." In that moment, everything Marcus believed about honor and duty cracked like glass hitting stone. He realized that the man he had sworn to protect was not the noble king he thought he served. The crown had become a symbol of oppression, not protection. The rebels were not criminals, they were heroes trying to help people who had been forgotten. Marcus looked around the throne room at the nobles in their expensive clothes, thinking about the starving villages he had seen during his travels. He thought about the children with hollow eyes who begged for scraps while the palace threw away enough food to feed 100 families. The contrast had always bothered him, but he had pushed those thoughts away, telling himself that this was simply how the world worked. "I need time to prepare for this mission, Your Majesty," Marcus said carefully, his mind racing with new understanding. The king smiled, but it was not a kind smile. "Of course, Captain. But remember, loyalty to the crown is the highest virtue. Those who forget this lesson often find themselves replaced." As Marcus left the throne room, his footsteps felt heavier than ever before. The hallways that once felt like home now seemed like the corridors of a prison. Portraits of past kings looked down at him with painted eyes that seemed to judge his every thought. He passed guards who saluted him with respect, not knowing that their captain was beginning to question everything they all stood for. That night, Marcus sat in his quarters, staring at his reflection in his polished sword. The man looking back at him wore the uniform of the royal guard, but inside something fundamental had changed. He could no longer serve a king who saw helping the poor as a crime. He could no longer call himself a protector when he was asked to harm those who protected others. The choice before him was clear, but terrifying. He could follow orders and maintain his position, living comfortably while innocent people suffered. Or he could choose justice over loyalty, knowing that this choice would cost him everything he had worked for his entire life. The silver eagle on his chest felt heavier than armor as he realized that true honor might require him to betray the crown he had sworn to serve. Marcus spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with his conscience. Every morning he put on his uniform and performed his duties, but inside, he felt like an actor playing a role that no longer fit. During the day, he trained new recruits, inspected the palace defenses, and attended strategy meetings. At night, he walked the palace grounds alone, thinking about the choice that would change his life forever. On the 4th morning, Marcus made his decision. Instead of riding east to capture the rebels, he would go to warn them. He knew this meant betraying his oath, abandoning his position, and likely facing execution for treason. But he also knew he could no longer serve a king who treated kindness as a crime. Marcus carefully planned his departure. He couldn't simply leave. Too many people would notice the sudden absence of the captain of the royal guard. Instead, he told his lieutenant that he was conducting a secret reconnaissance mission and would return within a week. This would buy him enough time to reach the rebels and help them escape before the king realized what had happened. He packed light, taking only essential supplies and leaving behind all symbols of his rank except for his sword. As he saddled his horse in the pre-dawn darkness, Marcus felt both terrified and relieved. For the first time in months, he was acting according to his conscience rather than his orders. The ride east took 2 days through winding mountain paths and dense forests. Along the way, Marcus saw evidence of the kingdom's problems everywhere. Burned-out farms where families had been unable to pay crushing taxes, empty villages where people had fled to search for work, children in tattered clothes who watched him pass with suspicious eyes, probably wondering if he was another royal official come to take what little their families had left. When Marcus finally reached the eastern provinces, he was shocked by what he found. Instead of the lawless wasteland he had expected, he discovered thriving communities working together to solve their problems. Gardens flourished where once there had been bare ground. Children played in clean courtyards while learning to read from makeshift books. Adults worked together to build houses, share tools, and care for the elderly and sick. Marcus approached carefully, knowing that his royal uniform would mark him as an enemy. He was stopped by a group of men carrying farming tools as weapons. Their leader was a tall woman with calloused hands and intelligent eyes. She introduced herself as Elena, and Marcus could see immediately why the people followed her. "I'm Captain Marcus Blackwood," he said, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I've come to warn you. The king has ordered your arrest. You have perhaps 2 days before royal soldiers arrive." Elena studied him carefully. Why would a captain of the royal guard warn us? This could be a trap. Marcus understood her suspicion. He removed his sword and placed it on the ground between them. "Because I've seen what you're doing here. You're helping people, not harming them. The king calls this treason, but I call it justice." Over the next few hours, Marcus learned the truth about the rebels. They were not violent revolutionaries, but ordinary people who had decided to take care of each other when their government abandoned them. Elena had been a teacher before the king closed schools in poor areas to save money. Others were farmers, craftsmen, and former soldiers who had grown tired of watching their neighbors suffer while the palace lived in luxury. "We never planned to challenge the king," Elena explained as they walked through the community. "We just wanted to help our people survive. But when children are starving while nobles feast, staying silent becomes its own form of evil." Marcus saw mothers teaching children to read using pages torn from old books. He watched men sharing tools to build homes for families who had lost everything to tax collectors. He observed healers treating the sick with herbs grown in community gardens. Everything he witnessed stood in stark contrast to the waste and selfishness he had seen at the palace. That evening, as the community gathered for a simple meal of bread and vegetable soup, Marcus made an announcement that surprised everyone, including himself. "I want to help you escape, but I also want to join you. The crown I served has become corrupted. Real honor means standing with those who help others, not those who harm them." Elena looked at him with a mixture of hope and concern. "You understand what this means? You can never go back. You'll be marked as a traitor. They'll hunt you for the rest of your life." Marcus nodded. "I've worn the uniform of the royal guard for 20 years. I thought it meant protecting people. Now I know that sometimes protecting people means standing against those in power. The community debated his offer late into the night. Some trusted him immediately, moved by his willingness to sacrifice everything for strangers. Others worried that accepting a former royal captain would bring more danger. Eventually, Elena spoke for the group. If you truly want to join us, you need to understand that we're not trying to overthrow the kingdom. We're trying to build something better. We believe that everyone deserves food, shelter, education, and dignity. Are you willing to fight for those ideals, even when it means opposing everything you once served? Marcus looked around at the faces illuminated by firelight. These people had nothing compared to the wealth of the palace, but they had something far more valuable. They had chosen to care for each other rather than themselves. In their simple community, he had found the honor that had been missing from his life as a royal guard. Yes, Marcus said firmly. I'm ready to serve justice instead of power. As the community prepared to evacuate the next morning, Marcus used his knowledge of royal military tactics to help plan their escape routes. But even as he worked to save these good people, he knew that his choice would eventually lead him back to face the consequences of his betrayal. The escape went smoothly at first. Marcus used his military training to guide the community through hidden mountain passes that royal soldiers wouldn't know about. Elena led the civilians while Marcus scouted ahead, watching for signs of pursuit. For 3 days they moved deeper into the wilderness, helping elderly members of the group and carrying children who grew tired from the long journey. Marcus felt a sense of purpose he had never experienced as a royal guard. Instead of enforcing the king's will through fear, he was helping people find safety and hope. The simple meals shared around campfires felt more meaningful than any royal feast he had attended. Children who had been afraid of his uniform now looked to him for protection and guidance. On the 4th day, everything changed. Marcus was scouting a ridge overlooking their next camping spot when he spotted dust clouds in the distance. Royal cavalry was approaching faster than he had expected. His heart sank as he counted the riders. At least 50 soldiers led by his own lieutenant, Thomas Crane. Marcus raced back to warn the others. They found us, he announced breathlessly. We have maybe an hour before they arrive. Panic rippled through the group. Some wanted to scatter into the forest. Others suggested trying to negotiate. Elena remained calm, but Marcus could see the worry in her eyes as she looked at the children and elderly people who couldn't run fast enough to escape mounted soldiers. There's only one way, Marcus said, his voice heavy with the weight of his decision. I'll go back and surrender myself. If they capture me, they might be satisfied enough to let you escape. Elena grabbed his arm. That's suicide, Marcus. You know what the king does to traitors? Marcus smiled sadly. I knew this day would come when I chose to help you. At least this way it means something. Take care of these people, Elena. Show the world that there's a better way to live. Despite protests from the community, Marcus mounted his horse and rode toward the approaching soldiers. As he crested the hill, he saw Lieutenant Crane leading the column, his face grim with duty. These were men Marcus had trained and fought beside. Some of them owed their lives to his leadership in past battles. Now they had come to capture him as a criminal. Marcus rode slowly toward them, his hands visible and empty. When he was close enough to be heard, he called out to his former lieutenant. Thomas, I surrender myself to you. The people I was protecting are gone. There's no need to search for them. Lieutenant Crane raised his hand and the column stopped. He rode forward alone to meet Marcus, his expression filled with confusion and disappointment. Captain, what have you done? The king is furious. He's declared you a traitor to the crown. I chose to protect innocent people instead of persecuting them. Marcus replied calmly. I'd make the same choice again. Thomas shook his head. You were like a father to me, Captain. You taught me everything about honor and duty. How could you betray everything we stand for? Marcus looked at his former student with compassion. I didn't betray honor, Thomas. I finally found it. Real honor means protecting those who cannot protect themselves, even when it costs you everything. The arrest was conducted with military efficiency. Marcus was shackled and placed on a horse for the journey back to the capital. During the long ride, he had time to think about what awaited him. He knew the king's justice was swift and brutal for those who defied royal authority. Most likely, he would face execution within days of his return, but instead of fear, Marcus felt an unexpected peace. For the first time in his life, he had acted purely according to his conscience. He had chosen to stand with the powerless against the powerful, to defend kindness instead of cruelty. Whatever happened next, he could face it with dignity. As they traveled, Marcus noticed that several of the younger soldiers seemed troubled by his arrest. They had served under him and respected his leadership. Some even asked quietly why he had chosen to help rebels instead of capturing them. Marcus answered honestly, explaining what he had seen in the eastern provinces and why he believed the king's orders were wrong. "But Captain," one young soldier said, "if we start questioning orders, how can any army function? How can we maintain order?" Marcus considered the question carefully before responding. "An army should serve justice, not just power. When orders require us to harm innocent people, we become the very thing we're supposed to protect against. True order comes from protecting the weak, not crushing them." These conversations planted seeds of doubt in some of the soldiers' minds. Marcus could see them struggling with the same questions that had tormented him in the palace. He hoped that someday, these men might also find the courage to choose justice over blind obedience. As the capital city came into view, Marcus saw crowds gathering along the roads. Word had spread that the famous captain of the royal guard had been arrested for treason. Some people looked at him with anger, believing he had betrayed their security. Others watched with curiosity, wondering what could drive such a respected soldier to risk everything. But Marcus also noticed something else in the crowds, faces that showed understanding, even admiration. These were the faces of people who worked long hours for little pay, who worried about feeding their children, who had been ignored by those in power. They seemed to recognize that his sacrifice meant someone had finally chosen to stand with them, instead of against them. When they reached the palace gates, Marcus was taken directly to the royal dungeons. The same guards who had once saluted him now locked iron chains around his wrists and ankles. The stone cell was cold and dark, lit only by a single torch that cast dancing shadows on the walls. As Marcus sat on the hard stone floor, he thought about Elena and the community. He hoped they had found safety in the deep mountains where royal soldiers rarely ventured. He hoped they would continue building their better way of life, proving that people could care for each other without kings or nobles to control them. The heavy footsteps of guards echoed in the corridor outside his cell. Soon Marcus knew he would face the king's judgment, but he had already judged himself and found peace with his choices. The dungeon beneath the royal palace was a place Marcus had never seen before, despite his 20 years of service. As captain of the royal guard, he had been responsible for palace security, but the king had always handled prisoners through other channels. Now, chained in the damp darkness, Marcus understood why this place was kept hidden from those who served the crown. The stone walls wept with moisture, and rats scurried across the floor without fear of the torchlight. Marcus shared the corridor with a dozen other prisoners, men and women whose only crime seemed to be speaking against royal policies or being unable to pay crushing taxes. An old man in the next cell had been imprisoned for teaching children to read without royal permission. A young woman was there because she had organized her village to share food during a harsh winter. "So you're the famous Captain Blackwood," said a voice from the shadows. Marcus turned to see a middle-aged man with intelligent eyes and a scholar's soft hands. "I'm Professor William Hart. I was arrested 3 months ago for writing that all people should have equal rights under the law." Marcus introduced himself and learned the stories of his fellow prisoners. Each tale followed the same pattern: ordinary people who had tried to help others or speak truth to power, only to be labeled as criminals by a king who saw any challenge to his authority as treason. The professor had been beaten during his arrest. The old teacher had been separated from his sick wife, who was probably dead by now. The young woman's children had been left with no one to care for them. As days passed in the dungeon, Marcus began to understand the true scope of the king's oppression. These were not isolated cases of justice, but a systematic effort to crush anyone who might inspire others to demand better treatment. The king ruled through fear, and the dungeons were his tool for breaking the spirits of those who dared to hope for change. "Why haven't we been brought to trial?" Marcus asked the professor during one of their whispered conversations. Professor Hart laughed bitterly. "Trial? The king doesn't want public trials for people like us. Too many citizens might hear our words and start asking uncomfortable questions. He prefers to let us rot down here until we're forgotten." But Marcus had not been forgotten. On his 5th day in the dungeon, Heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor, followed by the jangle of keys. Guards unlocked his cell and dragged him up stone stairs that seemed to climb forever. He was brought not to a courtroom, but to a private chamber where King Edmund waited alone. The king looked older than Marcus remembered, his face marked by the stress of ruling through cruelty. He paced back and forth while Marcus stood chained before him, water still dripping from his clothes after the guards had forced him to wash. 20 years, the king said without looking at Marcus. 20 years of loyal service, and you throw it all away for a group of peasants who don't even pay taxes. Marcus remained silent, knowing that any words would only increase the king's anger. Do you know what your betrayal has cost me? The king continued. Other nobles are beginning to question my authority. Some of my own guards are asking why I arrested you. The eastern provinces are in complete rebellion now, inspired by your example. You've created chaos throughout my kingdom. Finally, Marcus spoke. I've shown people that there's an alternative to living in fear. They're not rebelling against you personally, Your Majesty. They're fighting for the right to help each other without being called criminals. The king spun around, his face red with rage. They're my subjects. I decide what rights they have. I decide who lives and who dies. You've forgotten that everything you are came from serving me. No, Your Majesty, Marcus said quietly. Everything I am came from trying to protect people. I just finally realized that sometimes protecting people means standing against those who would harm them. For a moment, the king looked genuinely confused, as if he couldn't understand how anyone could value justice over personal loyalty. I could have you executed immediately, he said. Treason carries a death sentence, Marcus nodded. I know, but I'm not going to execute you, the king continued, and Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with his wet clothes. That would make you a martyr. Instead, I'm going to keep you alive in the dungeons as an example. Everyone will know that this is what happens to those who betray the crown. You'll spend the rest of your life in darkness, forgotten and abandoned. The king's cruel smile made Marcus's stomach turn. Your rebel friends have probably already forgotten about you. People like that don't really care about each other. They're just using pretty words to hide their selfishness. When times get hard, they'll abandon each other just like you abandoned your oath to me. Marcus was dragged back to the dungeons, but now his situation was different. The king had made it clear that there would be no trial, no execution, no end to his imprisonment. He would simply disappear into the darkness below the palace, another victim of royal justice. But something unexpected happened during his return journey through the palace halls. As guards marched him past windows overlooking the courtyard, Marcus saw small groups of people gathering outside the palace gates. They weren't shouting or making demands, they were simply standing in silence, holding candles in the daylight. What's happening out there? Marcus asked one of the guards. The guard looked nervous before answering. Word has spread about your arrest, sir. Some people have been gathering every day since you were brought back. They're not causing trouble, just standing there. The king has ordered us to ignore them. Back in his cell, Professor Hart was eager to hear about Marcus's meeting with the king. When Marcus described the silent vigil outside the palace, the older man's eyes lit up with hope. They remember you, the professor said. The people remember that someone finally chose to stand with them. That's more powerful than the king realizes. As night fell over the dungeon, Marcus lay on the stone floor and thought about the candle holders outside. He had expected his choice to end with his imprisonment, but perhaps it was just the beginning. Perhaps his willingness to sacrifice everything for justice had planted seeds that would continue growing long after he was gone. Weeks passed in the dungeon, but Marcus noticed changes happening above ground. The guards who brought their meager daily meals seemed increasingly uncomfortable with their duty. Some of them had served under Marcus and found it difficult to treat their former captain as a common criminal. Others were simply troubled by the growing crowds outside the palace. The vigil is getting bigger, whispered a young guard named Peter as he slipped an extra piece of bread through the bars. My sister says there are hundreds of people now, coming from villages all over the kingdom. They bring their own food and take turns keeping the candles lit. Marcus was amazed that his sacrifice had inspired such a response. He had expected to be forgotten quickly, but instead, his imprisonment had become a symbol of something larger. People who had never met him were willing to stand in silent protest against injustice. Professor Hart had become Marcus's closest companion in the dungeon. The older man's knowledge of law and history helped Marcus understand why his actions had resonated so powerfully with ordinary citizens. For generations, people have been told that they must accept whatever their rulers decide, the professor explained. When you chose justice over obedience, you proved that individuals have the power to make moral choices, even when it costs everything. But the growing protest outside was creating problems for the king. Nobles from other kingdoms were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about why such a respected military officer had been imprisoned without trial. Trade merchants reported that travelers were avoiding the kingdom because of stories about royal oppression. Most dangerously, similar vigils were starting in other cities throughout the realm. On a cold morning in his 3rd month of imprisonment, Marcus was awakened by unusual sounds from above, shouting, running footsteps, and the clash of metal on metal. The dungeon guards had disappeared, leaving the prisoners locked but unattended. Professor Hart pressed his face to the small window high in his cell wall. "Something's happening," he reported excitedly. "I can see smoke and crowds moving in the courtyard. The vigil has turned into something bigger." Hours passed without any guards appearing. The prisoners called to each other through the bars, sharing information and trying to understand what was happening above them. Some thought the palace might be under attack from a foreign army. Others hoped that the people had finally risen up against the king's cruelty. Finally, as evening shadows began to fill the dungeon, they heard footsteps on the stairs. But these weren't the heavy boots of guards, they were lighter, more hurried. A group of people appeared carrying torches, led by a familiar figure that made Marcus's heart leap with joy. Elena stood outside his cell, holding a ring of keys taken from the missing guards. Behind her were several members of the community Marcus had helped escape, along with townspeople he didn't recognize. They all looked at him with a mixture of relief and determination. "We've come to take you home," Elena said as she unlocked his cell door. Marcus stumbled out, his legs weak from months of imprisonment. "How did you get here? What's happening above?" "The vigil kept growing," Elena explained as she freed the other prisoners. "People from every corner of the kingdom came to stand for justice. When the king tried to disperse them with soldiers, more people came. When he threatened to arrest the protesters, even some of his own guards refused to obey." Professor Hart, now free from his own cell, laughed with genuine joy. "A revolution of conscience," he said. "The most powerful kind." As they climbed the stairs from the dungeon, Marcus saw evidence of the day's events. Palace corridors were empty of guards, and windows had been broken by stones thrown by angry crowds. But there was no widespread violence. This had been an uprising of ordinary people demanding justice, not a military conquest. They emerged into a courtyard filled with hundreds of citizens holding torches and candles. When they saw Marcus, a cheer went up that echoed off the palace walls. These were farmers, craftsmen, teachers, and shopkeepers who had traveled from distant villages to demand his freedom. Many of them had never seen him before, but they understood what he represented. "Where is the king?" Marcus asked Elena as they moved through the celebrating crowd. "Gone," she replied. "He fled this morning when he realized that his own guards were beginning to side with the protesters. Some say he's hiding in a fortress to the north. Others think he's left the kingdom entirely." Marcus felt a complex mix of emotions. He was grateful for his freedom and amazed by the courage of the people who had secured it. But he also worried about what would come next. Overthrowing a tyrant was easier than building a just society to replace him. As if reading his thoughts, Elena took his arm and led him to a quiet corner of the courtyard. "We need your help, Marcus. These people look to you as a leader, but we don't want to simply replace one ruler with another. We want to build something different. A government that serves the people instead of controlling them." Marcus looked out at the faces illuminated by torchlight. These were the people he had chosen to serve when he left the royal guard. They were the people who had risked everything to secure his freedom, proving that ordinary citizens could change the world when they acted with courage and unity. "I'm not a politician," Marcus told Elena. "I'm just a soldier who learned the difference between serving power and serving justice." "That's exactly why we need you," she replied. "You've already proven that you'll sacrifice everything for what's right. Help us build a kingdom where no one has to make that choice between conscience and survival." As the celebration continued around them, Marcus realized that his journey from loyal captain to imprisoned traitor had been just the beginning. Now came the harder task of proving that people could govern themselves with wisdom and compassion, creating a society where helping others was celebrated rather than punished. The months following the king's flight were the most challenging of Marcus's life. Leading armies into battle had been simple compared to helping build a new form of government. The people who had united to free him from prison now had to learn how to work together to run an entire kingdom. Marcus found himself at the center of these efforts, not because he sought power, but because others trusted his judgment. He had proven his commitment to justice over personal gain, and that reputation made him a natural mediator when disputes arose between different groups. The first major challenge came from the nobles who had remained in the kingdom after the king's departure. Some genuinely wanted to help build a better society, but others were only interested in protecting their wealth and privileges. They demanded representation in any new government, arguing that their education and experience made them essential leaders. "We can't simply ignore them," Professor Hart advised during one of the council meetings held in what used to be the royal throne room. "Many of them control vast estates that employ thousands of people. If we alienate them completely, we risk economic collapse." But Elena and the other community leaders were suspicious of including nobles in the new government. "These are the same people who stood by while the king oppressed us," Elena argued. "How can we trust them to suddenly care about justice?" Marcus listened to both sides before offering his perspective. "We judge people by their actions, not their birth or past mistakes. Any noble who wants to participate must prove their commitment to our principles by their deeds, not their words." This approach led to the creation of a unique system. Instead of automatic representation based on wealth or bloodline, all potential leaders had to earn their positions through community service. Nobles who wanted political roles first had to work alongside common citizens, farming, building, teaching, or caring for the sick. Only those who demonstrated genuine commitment to helping others were allowed to participate in governance. Some nobles were outraged by this requirement and left the kingdom to join the exiled king. But others embraced the opportunity to prove themselves through service rather than privilege. Lord William Ashford, who had once collected taxes ruthlessly, spent 6 months helping to rebuild villages destroyed by those same taxes. Lady Catherine More used her education to establish schools in remote areas that had never seen a teacher. The new government structure was unlike anything that had existed before. Instead of a single ruler making all decisions, the kingdom was divided into regions, each governed by councils elected by local citizens. These regional councils sent representatives to a national assembly that met quarterly to address kingdom-wide issues. Marcus was elected as the first chancellor, a position that carried responsibility for coordinating between regions and representing the kingdom in dealings with other nations. But unlike the old monarchy, this role came with strict limits and regular accountability to the people. One of the most difficult challenges came from neighboring kingdoms, whose rulers were deeply worried about the revolutionary ideas spreading from Marcus's homeland. They feared that their own subjects might be inspired to demand similar changes, threatening the traditional power of kings and nobles throughout the region. King Harold of the Western Kingdom sent ambassadors, demanding that Marcus's government pay tribute and acknowledge royal authority, as the previous regime had done. When these demands were refused, he threatened military invasion to restore proper order. "We've barely learned how to govern ourselves," worried Elena during an emergency council session. "How can we fight a war against professional armies?" Marcus had been thinking about this problem for weeks. "We don't fight them the way they expect," he said. "Traditional armies rely on forcing people to fight for causes they don't believe in. Our strength comes from people who are fighting to protect something they've built together." When King Harold's army arrived at the border, they found something unexpected. Instead of meeting a traditional military force, they encountered entire communities of armed citizens who had organized to defend their new way of life. Farmers fought alongside former nobles, teachers stood guard with merchants, and elderly citizens provided support and strategy. More importantly, many of King Harold's own soldiers began to question why they were fighting against people who were simply trying to build a more just society. Desertion became a serious problem in the invading army, as soldiers learned about the reforms happening in Marcus's kingdom. The war lasted only 3 months before King Harold was forced to withdraw. His army had not been defeated in direct battle, but it had been undermined by the power of example. His own people had begun demanding the same rights and freedoms they saw across the border. As years passed, the experiment in democratic governance faced many challenges. There were disagreements about resource allocation, disputes between regions with different priorities, and constant pressure from neighboring kingdoms that viewed the new system as a threat to their own authority. But the kingdom also achieved remarkable successes. Poverty decreased dramatically as policies focused on ensuring everyone had access to food, shelter, and education. Crime rates dropped because people had legitimate ways to improve their lives. Innovation flourished as individuals were free to pursue ideas without needing royal permission. Marcus often walked through the same eastern provinces where he had first met Elena and her community. The villages that had once struggled to survive now thrived with new schools, improved farms, and small industries that provided employment for everyone who wanted to work. Children who had once begged for food now attended classes and dreamed of becoming teachers, healers, or craftspeople. On his 60th birthday, Marcus stood before the National Assembly to give his final speech as Chancellor. He had served 3 terms and was stepping down to make room for new leadership, as the Constitution required. 20 years ago, I wore the uniform of the Royal Guard and believed that honor meant blind obedience to authority, he told the assembled representatives. I learned that real honor means choosing justice over convenience, truth over comfort, and service over power. You have taught me that ordinary people, when they work together with courage and compassion, can build a better world than any king ever imagined. As he walked away from the podium for the last time, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him from the palace dungeons to this moment. He had entered prison alone, a man who had lost everything he thought mattered. He emerged as part of a movement that had transformed not just his own life, but the lives of countless others who had been forgotten by those in power. The kingdom still faced challenges and would continue to face them. But Marcus knew that the principles they had established, that governments should serve people rather than control them, that justice matters more than tradition, and that everyone deserves dignity and opportunity, would endure long after he was gone. In choosing justice over the crown, he had helped create something far more valuable than any throne, a society where future generations could make their own choices about how to live and govern themselves.